Clint Eastwood is not God. Now, that may come as a rude shock to some of you, and perhaps it sounds somewhat heretical, but Clint Eastwood is not God. Of course, in some ways he's to be admired and respected as a film director and actor, but he's not God. Now, don't get me wrong, I've been a great admirer of his work, and I think films like Play Misty for Me and the great Western Unforgiven were really important films. But it's the persona, the public persona of Clint Eastwood that interests me. And I think it first came to light in the series of films in which he played the character, the detective, the rough detective Harry Callahan, Dirty Harry, who broke the rules. He had some success before that in the TV series Rawhide, and of course there was a series of spaghetti westerns. But it was really with the Dirty Harry movies that he came to fame. And the persona of Dirty Harry was this ruthless detective who would virtually do anything to capture or destroy, in fact kill, the criminal. And he did it with the utmost cool. He unflinching, unmoving. There was a stoic indifference about Dirty Harry, which we've come to associate with the figure of Eastwood. So even about 20 years later, after the Dirty Harry movies, something like Unforgiven, there's this stoic indifference. Although there's a slight twist in the character in Unforgiven, because in some ways Dirty Harry was a hollow man, but with the character in Unforgiven, you sense that behind that stoic indifference is a tragedy. There is some anguish, but the character doesn't know what to do with it. I'm presenting this image of Clint Eastwood because I think there are both cultural and theological implications. In our own era, in wider society, it is still fashionable to be cool, to mask or to act out this stoic indifference. And the risk of that is not only personal. I mean, someone who lives behind the charade of the cool is often a very lonely person, but culturally it doesn't encourage generous acts of care. And in fact, one of the most redeeming things of recent days in the era of the virus have been generous and unexpected acts of care. So with this image in mind of Dirty Harry, or in particular the persona of Clint Eastwood and this stoic indifference, I want us to look at a contrasting image, and it's an image associated with Jesus of Nazareth and his radical and passionate commitment to care, to feeling with and for others. Now, there's one text that we can look at from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 11, verse 19. It's just a small text, and arguably this small text captures the essence of the Christian gospel. And the text it's a description of Jesus, and it describes him as a friend of tax collectors and sinners. It's a stunning text, part of a pastiche of various texts describing the ministry and nature of Jesus, but captured just in these few words is the essence of what it means to care. Now, this particular text is arguably one of the early pieces of gossip that we can identify in the ancient world. Gossip itself is now a field of modern study, and there are two major streams that look into the issue or the theme of gossip. One sees gossip as a kind of bonding thing, shared act of affection. You share a piece of gossip about someone with someone that you trust, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a destructive piece of information. There's a more pernicious view of gossip as something that can be abusive. You white ant someone at the university or at the hospital or the school. Now, if we come back to this piece of gossip in the Gospel of Matthew, both those nuances are there. I suspect that Jesus did have a negative reputation because of whom he associated with, so that some people dismissed Jesus in the sense of, forget about him, he's a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But on the other hand, and now I'm thinking of the people who knew him and the people who received these ancient stories, I suspect that this verse has a great deal of affection. Yes, indeed, he was a friend of tax collectors and sinners. It's a wonderful text. There's an element of social justice, that is, tax collectors were despised. They were either directly or indirectly appointed by Rome, and sinners could include people who had disability. They could include women per se, or women of the wrong ethnic group. So the fact that Jesus was a friend of tax collectors and sinners represents a physical embodiment of his commitment to a ministry or a faith of inclusion that crosses social, religious and political boundaries. But it's also an expression of the care he had, that Jesus was not channeling Stoic indifference. Jesus was living out care, practical care, care that was visceral. He felt for people. He wanted to create friendships with people. So from this one text there emerges what I think is a radical practice of care. The word care is bandied about these days. Everyone's caring, and it can become an empty term. But the kind of care that Jesus is modelling is radical. It's about taking risks, and it comes from the heart, and it is done with feeling. What a contrast this is to the fashionable cool or the studied indifference of our own era. We've come to admire people like Eastwood who can channel this Stoic indifference. But in many ways, this indifference masks not only often an emptiness inside of the person, but also it permits lack of care. It permits indifference. The image that we have of Jesus represents a very different view of care, and behind it is a very significant understanding of theology. There was a great book published in Germany in 1973 by Jürgen Moltmann called The Crucified God. And there wouldn't be too many practicing theologians these days who have not read that book. And it's a brilliant book, but arguably the turning point or the piece de resistance in that book is a description that Moltmann does of the nature of God. Moltmann recognises, in a way, that from about the 2nd and 3rd centuries in the Common Era, under the influence of the Hellenization of the Church and various philosophies like Gnostic philosophies or Neoplatonic philosophies and Stoicism, that what emerged in the Christian church was a kind of Clint Eastwood God, a God who was remote, who was not moved, who was unaffected by the pain or tragedy of human beings. Now behind this was that Neoplatonic suspicion of the physical world, or matter itself was regarded with some sense of hostility. And so this God, who was indifferent, modelled a certain kind of cold, pure perfection. And Moltmann reminds us in this extraordinary book, The Crucified God, that this is not the God of Jesus. The God of Jesus is the God who feels passionately with us and for us. This is the God who feels. And Moltmann reminds us of the work and ministry of the ancient prophets. Their God wasn't indifferent. Their God hurt. Their God cried. Their God yearned. Their God felt. So Jesus himself then not only carries on this ministry of feeling with and for others, and developing this radical practice of care, but also Jesus himself represents the embodiment of the God who cares. This God is not remote. This God is not perfect in the sense of spotless or immune to human suffering. This God is with us. This God is among us. This God feels our pain. This God feels our loneliness. This God feels our anxiety, not from afar, but from deep within. And that view, that understanding of God, changes everything about what it means to be Christian and the practice of Christian ethics and the practice of care. Now, it's interesting just to think for a moment about the word care. It's a very interesting word. There's not exactly an equivalent, for example, in French of the word care. I mean, obviously, French people can be very caring, but it's the word care that I'm interested in. There's a German word Sorge, which is also not exactly the same as the English word. The German word has the sense of anguish or concern, deep anguish, which I think captures something of the care that Jesus emulated. But the English word goes back to the Old English or Gothic, and a word called kara, which has to do with lament. And when you think about it, if you go back and look at those important times in your life where someone has cared for you, where they've felt with you and for you, there is an element of shared lament, of a passionate expression of grief, that your life or my life really matters, and that this friend or this other person is deeply moved by what is taking place in our lives. In this era, where people are doing it hard, the last thing we need is stoic indifference, or what is you could describe as the fashionably cool. We need leaders and we need communities who can embody and express this passionate sense of care. Now, I'm tempted this afternoon to perhaps dig up an old Clint Eastwood movie. For years he was that persona of Clint Eastwood, the stoic indifference. He was a bit of a hero for me, and over the years, I guess in some ways I was tempted to channel him, although the closest I ever got was Ricky Gervais. But I suspect if I watched one of these Eastwood films, I would in fact not enjoy it perhaps as I did as a young man, but I suspect I'd feel a little sad, because there's something empty or hollow there, and in a way it would remind me of my own need for genuine and authentic care. These are difficult times. Yet there are signs of hope not only within the life of the Christian church, but in other faiths and in other communities, of people who have rediscovered the power of care, where we care deeply with others, where we sit beside others, where we lament with them because we really care. Jesus was indeed a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Fantastic text. There's the Christian gospel in its purest form, celebrating the fact that social justice issues are central to the Christian tradition, but also Jesus cared passionately, and Jesus represents and embodies the God who feels deeply. In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer and Sustainer. Amen.